Welcome to Renegade Thinkers Unite, a show that will help you transform your marketing from mere messaging to programs that break the rules and make a difference. Join the movement today and learn non-traditional techniques that give you an edge. Now, here's your Chief Marketing Renegade, Drew Nizer.
My guest today is Jerome Nadel, Senior Vice President and CMO of Rambus, an amazing high-tech public company based in Silicon Valley. He joined Rambus in 2012 to help transform the company's business model to products and services with design-led marketing, a topic we are going to dive into deeply today. He has held a variety of Chief Marketing Officer and Chief User Experience Officer roles at a number of companies, and I want to point that out because that's not that usual, and it makes Jerome a special guy. But he worked at companies like Human Factors International, SLP Infoware, GemPlus, and Sagem. He also advises startups on marketing, positioning, and product service design. Jerome is a pioneer in user experience and service design, and as I mentioned, we are going to talk about that in depth because I can't wait to learn about it. So welcome to the show, Jerome.
Well, thank you so much.
Hey, it was great to see you again at the CMO Club Summit, as always. Let's first, before we get started too deeply into this, I love my dear Aunt Judy, who we call the Taunt, but she's not necessarily as tech savvy as all your friends in Silicon Valley. Could you just sort of explain to her what Rambus does?
Yeah, that's a great question because we could get very technical and detailed, but we could keep it high level. So what I would say to Aunt Judy is Rambus moves data faster and safer. We develop and sell designs and products that accelerate data movement efficiently and securely. You know, moving data through digital interfaces at lightning speed is the foundation of modern computing. The web, big data, future of IoT, AI, connected everything. And making sure that data and devices use it in a secure way keeps us safe. So what we do is we license our designs to semiconductor companies to make their products faster and more secure.
Okay. Well, we all want things faster and more secure, so I suspect that's a good space to be in. Let's talk a little bit about, what makes you a renegade? And I'm just assuming that, that you are one because we've had some conversations, but is there room to be a renegade, in your role at Rambus?
I'd say independent of my role here, I would probably be a renegade with a capital R. As you mentioned in the intro, I was working in Europe. I was in Paris and came here in 2012. Recruited by my now boss, Dr. Ron Black, who I had worked with before in Europe. So he knew that I'm a bit quirky and, if you will, not a typical marketer. You know, he, and I'll just sort of begin with him, as a serial entrepreneur, has been an advocate for the value of user experience and design thinking. And when he brought me in, he sort of knew what he was getting. I'd say that I'm not a typical exec marketer. As we've shared a little bit, I work on a PhD in applied experimental psychology and spent most of my career in the design and user experience space. And it's just interesting, as we go back in time to see the language at almost a psycholinguistics level, the language of user experience has really changed. When I left graduate school in the 80s, we talked about human factors. And then in the 90s, we talked about usability. And as we came into the 2000s, the notion of differentiation through user experience became sort of the mantra for product success. So as we go deeper in the conversation, what I'll suggest is the difference between user experience and marketing or design-led marketing are really minimal. What user experience professionals focus on is the upstream concepting of what's the narrative that makes a product great. Not just what are its features, but how should it work? How does it support use cases? And often what marketers are focused on is telling stories about why products are great. And if you connect the stories that made the product great with the stories that reinforce and articulate their greatness, you have sort of beginning to end of full marketing. And, ironically, Drew, I don't think that's such a radical construct, but I think it's not embraced to the extent that it should be in the profession that we share.
Well, let's talk about this a little bit more in actual reality. And what I thought I heard you say is through the design process, we can actually bake a marketing idea into the product. And did I oversimplify that?
No, it should be simple. And it's exactly that. Firstly, and it's interesting for me with respect, I had come to the Bay Area, to Silicon Valley through my career on multiple times, even as an interface design consultant. And I was so excited to be part of the CMO community out here. But what I find is many people in very senior level roles, especially in larger organizations that sort of segment contribution, have CMOs today focused very much on downstream demand gen, lead gen, as their key sort of priority and KPI. That's important, but, again, design-led marketing embraces design thinking and is fundamentally connected to the product or service conception through what I would speak to as design methods. So on that, we're thinking about use cases and stories that are created to design the product or service and are natural and believable, so they should be used in promotion. I really advocate this approach, and simply what we're saying when you think agile, lean development is that the CMO organizationally might be more connected to product marketing, but from a sort of NPI or new product introduction methodology, the MRD, the marketing requirements that lead to the PRD, the product requirements, and ultimately the engineering requirements start with this way of thinking. So the stories that we create in product concepting and the use cases around that should be what we reinforce downstream. We make better things, they're easier to promote and sell.
You've been listening to another great interview on Renegade Thinkers Unite with Drew Neiser. But the value doesn't end there. As a listener, you can download a free ebook from Drew, Renegade Thinkers, interviews with 11 trailblazing CMOs any business can learn from. Top marketing thought leaders and proven executives from Time Warner, American Express, and Chico's, and others. Get your free copy at renegadethinkersunite.com/ebook. For listeners only at renegadethinkersunite.com/ebook.
I divide the CMOs that I have interviewed into a couple of camps, and there are those that I would call sort of leaders and those that are tacticians. And the leaders are the ones who have the courage to say, here's a vision, a long-term vision for the brand, and here's how the products are going to fit into that and help realize the vision. And then ultimately they get to that demand gen because they need to drive revenue, but they have metrics in place that are bigger than short-term revenue, that are bigger than lead generation. And so it sounds like that's what we're talking about a lot here is having a vision of developing products that have marketing ideas baked in so that it's a lot easier to sell them downstream as opposed to say, here's a bunch of products. Hey, you marketing guys, figure out how to sell them.
Yeah, I very much like that. So I think, the role of the Renaissance CMO, if you will, the design-led CMO is definitely connected, more ethereally to strategy and saying, where are we going to be in a 3 to 5 year horizon? But even more tactically, should be intimately connected to the requirements that go into products. And I think, again, one challenge with Silicon Valley is often product requirements are highly function-based, function feature, and they're not story-based. So what user experience folks think about is, what is the use case that we are trying to support? How would we do that? How does this work? And when you get into, products are not static. They support or services. And, more and more, again, as we've gone from a hardware society to a software society to everything as a service, everything becomes a verb, and there's movement around it. And I think the good design begins with looking at where are problems and opportunities? How might we solve them? As we go through our classical market segmentation, what would the use cases be by segment we're trying to address? How does that get codified into requirements for the product? What is the narrative around that? So I'm coming back to storytelling again. And I think when a company begins to think like that, the quality, the value of their products and services are immediately improved. And then when you move downstream, and again, I'm not backing off on KPIs connected to, demand, lead gen, and a direct connection to sales. I'm just suggesting, humbly that better products and services are easier to promote and sell.
No doubt.
And I think the remit of the CMO should go all the way upstream, not just downstream on demand and lead gen.
I love the expression design-led CMO, and we just found our headline. But you had so many things that you said that I also think are headlines, things like everything becomes a verb, which I love, and it's true. If you think about so many brands that own a space in our brain, I mean, we FedEx it, we Google it, right? And those brands are the definition, and I think that's what you meant by a verb. But let's go back to design-led CMO. If we were to have a group of future CMOs ahead of us, what would be, say, 2 or 3 things that design-led CMO would want to think about? How do they get started?
So, classical marketing is typically looking at, I have segments, I have competence, let me look at how my company could provide value into that space. I would really have them focus on, and let me step back a bit. And as we look at development methods like Agile, it fundamentally begins with, what are the user stories you are trying to address? And I guess what I'm suggesting is the way especially larger corporations have compartmentalized, the CMO, the role of corporate marketing, isn't connected to product marketing where you are thinking about user stories. So simply, and distilling it, what I would advocate to these future marketing leaders is you need to start upstream. You need to be thinking about these user stories and be connected, because that's going to be the foundation of the narrative you're going to use to promote later. And this is really the essence of what has been, for now a couple of decades, user-centered design. Really, if you think of user-centered design, and I'm waxing on a bit over here, you talk about the notion of, I have strategy. I'm going to do end-user research. I'm going to do low-fidelity prototype. I'm going to validate, and then I'm going to execute and deploy. So in this spirit, you're learning upfront. In fact, what I often have my group think about is what I call discovery, validation, execution. And I make sure that we spend time in discovery, that we're confident. And I make them bring that back to the executive team to say, in discovery, we have learned. We validated these hypotheses that are really a set of stories that we think are going to make a relevant, even in the semiconductor space, a relevant service or product. And then we get commitment to build on that. And then when it's ready to promote, we already have all of the ammunition in the toolbox that's going to have us be effective in promotion. So future CMOs, future marketeers, think user stories. Think in a verb, as you repeated, in a verb and action-oriented way.
Okay, that is a great place for us to take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk about a specific example of this in action, something that you've done at Rambus. And I also have some thoughts on, I suspect that you need to get this agreement for design thinking in place with a CEO who recognizes its importance. So anyway, we'll take a quick break. And we'll come back in just a second.
Renegade Thinkers Unite is brought to you by Social Media Explorer, the website that explores the world of social media from the inside out. Great advice from today's leading social media columnists and experts at socialmediaexplorer.com. That's socialmediaexplorer.com.
All right, we're back. My guest today is Jerome Nadel, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer at Rambus. And we've been talking about design-led thinking. We've talked about design-led marketing, and we have come up with a new type of CMO, the design-led CMO. And the first thing I want to, you mentioned at the very beginning that your CEO understands the power of design thinking. Do you think others, let's say a CMO shares the understanding of what design-led, prototyping and how to do this, they could succeed without a CEO who understands it as well?
Well, you can be successful, but I think you're going to be constrained. You could look at the sort of foundation of Silicon Valley. A lot of brilliant technologists become the leader of a company, and they're intrigued by the technology. Or you go to, a public company where CEOs unfortunately feel, especially when you're public, that it's all about quarterly revenue, and they get a bit myopic in terms of the value of the product. It's more about the revenue it creates. I think it's incumbent on the CMO, the marketer, to help influence, to show that more romantic view that good products do sell better. And I love the notion of incremental, where this doesn't all happen at once. You need to have quick wins where you demonstrate not only to leadership, perhaps your boss, the CEO, but to those that are, in the engineering and the development space, that this is working. And I can give a couple of examples, one that's really not the perfect sequence, but a way that I helped us learn that this way of thinking is valuable. And then I could give something newer that we're working on now that's a bit more classical in this methodology.
Oh, great.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So this is a bit esoteric. Stay with me. Appreciate that this company, Rambus, is a little bit, has a group, what we call Emerging Solutions Division, that is a bit greenfield. And we bring in, there's a lot of Stanford folks that are here. So, super high IQ folks that aren't necessarily grounded to creating product out of their thinking. There is one group that we have that focuses on computational imaging. And this is a bit far out because these guys came up from an algorithmic perspective. They came up with what we refer to as a lensless smart sensor. So as opposed to a standard camera that has a lens, and by definition, the refractive lens would bend to be able to focus an image, on a sensor. An alternative approach would be what we call diffractive lens, which would be a tiny flat disc that would let light through some cuts in that disc. And there would be algorithms tuned to say, a blob of light just came through. Let me reconstruct that into something that is visually meaningful. Okay? So this is a bit esoteric, and these guys came up with a system that, think of dust from an IoT perspective. These nanoscopic disks would be able to be in space with very low energy because they're super low flops in terms of the processing required, super low energy. And they would be able to be the eyes of IoT, if you will. They brought this technology to me and said, we think we have something here technologically. What could we do with it? So this was at some level a little bit ass backwards because we had what we felt was an exciting, brilliant technology, but it's what are we going to do with it? Now, the other side of that, at a cultural level, is this is a company that has a lot of IP and historically was licensing its intellectual property. So there had been historically a reluctance to share any technology until it was, again, sort of codified into something that could be monetized. But I looked at it in a different way. And I brought in, as, again, I've been in the design space, I brought in two firms, one Frog Design, who you might know, they're pretty premier, and another smaller firm out of Berlin is their headquarters called IXDS. And I said, guys, let's work together over here with sort of a matrixed approach of what are potential vertical market applications of this technology. And then we went further. And, with all of the maker movement around Arduino boards and Raspberry Pi boards, we actually created a small system that I named the Pod Kit. and POD, P-O-D, stood for Partners in Open Development. So on this mini computer, we had our sensor array, we had the algorithms, and we basically had API hooks with this SDK with the ability for others to build solutions on it. And I led, through Frog and IXDS, an initiative where they came up with some brilliant examples of how we could, sort of deploy and exploit this technology in different use cases, and use that as the foundation to create a partner program where we distributed hundreds of these boards. Again, we owned the intellectual property behind it. We wanted the market to help us identify the stories of how this could be exploited in field. And that helped us sort of back into and then we did the classic TAM, SAM analyses and what's the size of the market and where we should go. And just showing our team, firstly, being open is the only way to be relevant in the ecosystem. It's good for the brand and the benevolence of the company at large. But we're going to learn through this experience, and what we're doing here are defining relevant use cases and user stories of how we could exploit this technology. So, Drew, that was a bit long-winded, but
yeah. Let me ask you a couple questions about that, because that in and of itself is there's a couple of things that I noted there, and this is not an unusual case. I mean, a lot of times someone comes up with invents something and then they figure out what to do with it, and it's happened before. I mean, Post-it notes is a classic example. They found the glue. What do we do with it? Next thing you know, it was because he needed it for his music, and Post-it notes were born. So it's not unusual that it goes backwards. But I'm curious. You elected to, so you had this. And by the way, when you mentioned the very little hole, it reminded me of some of the early cameras, which were in fact just that, right? They just took a tiny pinpoint hole, and there was a homemade camera industry for years. Anyway, I digress. The point here is that what you did at the point that you had this technology was to say, let's bring in some other people who are creative and can think about possible uses of it. Then you decided to go out to the marketplace and say, hey, what else could you do with it? And I'm assuming eventually at the end of this, there were some products that you were able to sell on the marketplace.
Yes, and we sold the technology off as well. So it was a profitable endeavor for us. Yes.
So there you have it. And it's interesting, on multiple levels. And so I'm curious, what were the lessons learned from that experience? I mean, you talked about being open, and that, being open is the only way to go with something like this. But from a design-led, sort of, experience, what were the key lessons?
Yeah, wow. A lot. Again, taking this post here, I am not a semiconductor expert. I've given you my background. I sort of have a romantic view of technology as it makes life better. And this was a company that started in 1990 with some brilliant technology that was, again, monetizing through licensing. So I think the culture was firstly very secretive and closed. The notion of opening up to learn from others was a huge shift culturally, and demonstrated that our brand on the market improved. And we became more and more an ecosystem player, which affected the views of our board, senior management, all the way down, number one. Number two, being able, I think technologists often, again, look at things in a very static, functional way. And where these brilliant guys dedicated to this program really looked at the goodness of what they had come up with in how does it work, they didn't think about what does it do and why is it good. And being able to translate the brilliant functional capability into stories of value had them look very differently at what we do. So the biggest impact, I often say, one of the roles of the CMO is to get people to look outside in, not just inside out. So when we started getting positive traction externally around what we were doing, from, Wired to TechCrunch to, even the Wall Street Journal. They're like, wow, look at the goodness of what we created. But it wasn't the technology. It's what it did and the benefits that it enabled. So that was super exciting for me. And that was, I've been here 5 years now. That was probably the highlight of the first 3. And already increased the relevance of my group. And I even have user experience people in my group. So it's not a traditional, sort of corporate marketing function. And the company started feeling more confident about the relevance of its technology. Externally, we're getting more traction, and it comes back once again to design-led. Think in that way. To imagine that a company like Fraud Design would be collaborating with a semiconductor technology company like Rambus, humbly, I'd assert it would have never happened if I hadn't pushed that in that way.
You've been listening to another great interview on Renegade Thinkers Unite with Drew Neiser. But the value doesn't end there. As a listener, you can download a free ebook from Drew, Renegade Thinkers, interviews with 11 trailblazing CMOs any business can learn from. Top marketing thought leaders and proven executives from Time Warner, American Express, and Chico's, and others. Get your free copy at renegadethinkersunite.com/ebook. For listeners only at renegadethinkersunite.com/ebook.
What it sounds like is the process became the marketing. And as you were developing the story about, trying to figure out what do we do with this technology, that became the story about, Rambus as an innovative company, as a company that you want to do business with, as a company that gets it in the tech space. And so while you were, actually trying to create something that you could monetize, which you did, it sounds like that was the marketing, was the process of it. And I think it's pretty interesting.
It could have been organic. I'm not necessarily saying it was a master plan, but it did help. And, brand is culture, right? You've got to be transparent. I mean, admittedly and transparently, I joined in September of 2012. As part of the exec team, my first board meeting was in October. And one of the board members challenged me and said, when are you going to change the brand of the company? And, I'm a little bit direct. And I said, when we change our behavior. And we have. The company has fundamentally changed from the inside out and the perceptions outside in. I mean, to tout a bit, our stock has towards 4x'd. Our market cap has 4x'd as well. We've done better in these 5 years. And we're, as many companies and as many CMOs are tasked, you need to redefine yourself to maintain relevance. What made this company, brilliant in the 90s and IPO'd in 1997 is different than what we need to do now to be relevant. And that word is really big around here. And I push that a lot. What is our relevance? And, transitioning from we have great designs that people can license to we use our innovation in products that are differentiated is a radical shift, in the sort of raison d'être, in our reason for being. And yeah, I'm proud of that. I think that this design-led approach has helped convince us that this is the way to our future. And again, without Ron Black, without Dr. Black supporting that, where you began, it would have definitely been harder. But I think it's incumbent in an incremental way to show, guys, this is working. And that was just one example. We could sit down with, between us or with your audience, and there'd be some others to share as well. So I'm really excited and proud about that.
No, it's a great story, and you touched on a lot of things, and I'm going to attempt to summarize. So I have a producer, Kevin Crane, who's terrific at this, and he really tries to keep me to 20-25 minutes, and I know that we're over that already. So I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to come back to you with one thought. So as a CMO, to be able to, really make a difference at the company, one, obviously you need the support of your CEO. And then you need a shared vision. And in this case, the vision is we're going to be a design-led organization that thinks about outside in. In other words, we're going to figure out what are the stories that we can tell, that we need to tell, that are going to hopefully, find an unmet need, that someone may or may not even know they have yet. So there's a little bit of vision in there. And what's interesting to me is that we touched on at the very end is the process of design-led, marketing, became somewhat of the story, but it also changed the culture, because as you proved that this worked, people got on board and they said, whoa, okay, this is the future, of the company. We're going to change how we do business. We're going to change how we get to market. And I would guess it probably changed how you attracted and recruited people as well, because you obviously want to bring people in who can embrace the culture, and we'll get to that. So as I look at this thing, the key components, and just summarizing what design-led CMO has a very specific process. You described it as discovery, validation, and execution. And if you look up agile or design-led thinking, you'll find, and I'll include that in my show notes on Renegade Thinkers Unite, some links to some great examples of design-led thinking and how you do it. I think this has been a really interesting and important and differentiated way for a CMO to think about their job, and for marketers to be thinking about how they move forward in this dramatically changing universe where it is about service and figuring out what services you can provide. So I guess I would ask you, as I've attempted to summarize, Jerome, maybe you could to provide two of the hardest lessons learned that came out of this whole experience for you.
Yeah, well, firstly, what a great, succinct summary of my rambling, Drew. You're so good at that. So, it would be almost emotional. I mean, number one, I wish it happened faster. And you're going to fail to succeed. And you just have to accept that. So, it's easy to highlight the thing that worked. For everything that works, there's a set of them that don't. I would say is probably that first lesson learned. The other side of this is, again, we've talked about that upstream piece. Downstream is fundamentally important as well. And we, again, humbly here have really amplified downstream. And we didn't have a lot of time to talk about that. Just one other thing I'd like to highlight from more of a promotion, marketing, demand gen perspective is your content is critical. And, we hired some really talented creative writers, and the quality of our content and digital expression of that has really improved through time. And I think we sometimes underestimate, where we have external agencies, PR agencies of record, the days of, pitching to the journalist demigod and the dial and smile are gone. You need to create your own content to be meaningful, to talk about what you're doing. And that was a bit harder than I would have liked. And we've cycled through a couple of attempts at that, but I think we're on the way to really getting there now. So you want it to happen quickly. It doesn't always happen that fast. Keep going. Incremental improvement. And secondly, from, the downstream side, really nurture and care about your content. It's better when you already have the stories that came from, this design-led thinking, but content is king in terms of promotion and the quality. Have an internal editorial desk, because if you're just trying to buy it from the outside, I don't think you'll be as successful.
That's interesting. So I have a challenge for you as we wrap up the show. I think it's really totally agree with you that content is critical. I do think it can be outsourced if you're lucky enough to work with a firm like Renegade. But that aside,
sorry.
No, it's okay. I totally agree. And one of the things that we're working on here is look, if they can bring in the talent and do it in-house, amen. But one question for you as we wrap up here, I think it would be very cool if we could create a 1 or 2 page design-led marketing PDF, sort of that we could share with our listeners. And if you wanted, we could co-brand it, or you could come up with it, and I'll share it on the show notes. You think you could do that in a couple of weeks?
Absolutely.
All right.
With pleasure, and I think collaboration with you, you're going to make it better, for sure.
That's awesome. All right, so I'm going to ask all of you, you can go to renegadethinkersunite.com to find this, or you can just email me at dnizer@renegade.com. So, Jerome, thanks so much for being on Renegade Thinkers Unite. It's really been a fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much, Drew.
This has been Renegade Thinkers Unite, but it doesn't end there. Just go to renegadethinkersunite.com for more and subscribe to the show. That way, you'll never miss an episode. We'll talk with you next time on Renegade Thinkers Unite.